So with the conclusion of the first public Diablo 4 beta test, we have been seeing quite a lot of positive sentiment around the early stages of the game. But with all these new people coming into the community and learning more about the entirety of the game, there's been some big worries on other sections of the game. So in this video, I want to go over what some of those worries are and give all the information I have about all these different sections of the game so you can make the most informed decision on if you want to purchase this game and hopefully give some feedback that could potentially make the game better. And obviously we have to start off with monetization. And the first part of this conversation is if there's going to be pay to win elements in the game. And luckily enough, we have gotten quite a lot of statements from developers and officially from Blizzard, specifically saying that there is going to be no way to purchase any amount of power. In fact, there was a quarterly update released that is solely going over monetization, and probably over a dozen times they specifically mentioned there is going to be no way to purchase power or to buy anything that will affect gameplay or combat in any way at all. This also includes not being able to trade purchased cosmetics to other players, so there's not even going to be like a workaround where you could purchase items, give it to a player, and then they give you an in-game item. None of that. So if you're afraid about there being pay to win in the game, literally every ounce of information we have, specifically from the developers, is very specific on not allowing you to buy any piece of power. So I would fully expect, and it's guaranteed at this point, that there's not going to be anything you could purchase that's going to give you more power in combat, that's going to make you stronger, or anything of that nature. But this doesn't mean you're going to actually like the monetization that is in the game. So to run through all the pieces of monetization there's going to be, you have to purchase the game. There's a box cost. There's going to be a cosmetic only shop, so you can buy transmog pieces for any of your different characters. These are seeming to be primarily through full armor sets that are for a specific class, so they can't be used on other classes, but they can be used on every character of the same class. Then there's going to be a seasonal battle pass. There's going to be a new season of content that's free every 3 months, and with that there's going to be an optional battle pass that when you purchase it, you just get additional cosmetics and additional premium currency, which is the currency used for the cosmetic shop. So there's nothing you can get power-wise through the battle pass. It's just another way to buy cosmetics. And then somewhere down the road, there's a probability that we're going to also be buying expansions. Now, we pretty much don't have any information on this. I don't even think they've specifically said that we would be purchasing expansions, but that will almost certainly be the case. So a few years down the road, maybe we'll have an expansion released, but we don't know anything about that piece of the monetization or the future content of the game. So I would say that makes 4 primary ways of how the game is going to be monetized. So if this monetization structure is acceptable enough for you to want to buy the game and continue to play it, is going to be up to your own personal preference. And I personally don't really care about buyable cosmetics that much, but I don't want to linger on this subject because it usually devolves into some pretty stupid discussions. So that brings us to our next worrying section of the game, and that's the end game. So just to give you a very quick overview of the end game we can expect on launch, starting off with Helltides, which consists of Lilith and her armies taking over an entire region of the game. Everything there's going to be buffed up. You're going to get more loot for fighting in this area, and you're also going to get a new currency that allows you to open up some new chests to target farm specific types of loot. And these are only going to start occurring once you get into higher world tiers. Next up, we have Nightmare Dungeons, which start out as just the normal dungeons in the game that you've probably seen. There's going to be over 100 of these on launch, and once you get into the end game, you can start earning or crafting nightmare sigils, which are essentially dungeon keys, and these will turn any dungeon that sigil is applied to into a nightmare dungeon, which is just an end game version of that dungeon. Will have different afflictions that make the enemies inside it stronger, give them new effects, but also will give you increased loot. Then we have Whispers of the Dead, which I personally think of as a mix between Diablo 3 bounties and a World of Warcraft's world quest system. These are just changing objectives out in the open world you can go complete for rewards and a new currency called Grim Favors. Once you have enough of these Grim Favors, you go and turn them in to the Tree of Whispers for a large amount of loot and experience. And this is also said to be one of the ways that you can earn Nightmare Sigils for the Nightmare Dungeon system. Next up, we have Fields of Hatred, which are open world PvP zones located in different areas of the open world. Once you enter them, it's on. You can PvP with any other player that's there and earn PvP specific currencies that you're able to spend at PvP specific vendors to buy pieces of gear and PvP specific cosmetics. And then finally, we have Paragon boards, which is going to be the end game character progression system. It's these big checkerboards where you plot your way throughout, getting new stats, getting new effects that are specific to your class. And once you hit the edge of one of these boards, you apply another board on top of that to then progress your way through that. And there are earnable pieces of loot that you can socket into these boards as well, ending up in you having a little over 200 Paragon points to spend once you've hit max level. Now, one of the biggest areas of worry I've recently seen are people being worried about the replayability of the dungeon system. Because in the beta, you were able to go try out a bunch of the different dungeons in the first region, and a lot of people started to notice that a bunch of them had very similar objectives. A lot of them actually had the objective where you had to go do 2 different objectives to get keys, to open up the door, to get to the boss at the end of the dungeon. A lot of the dungeons share that kind of same objective. Not all of them, but a lot of them did share that, and that a lot of the dungeons didn't have as much variation on randomizing the routes and layout of the dungeon that people would have originally wanted. And I will say, for the objectives of this dungeon, I do hope these are more varied once we get into the other regions of the game and once we get into Nightmare Dungeons, because it does seem like when you go into Nightmare Dungeons, there may be more randomization possible than with the base versions of the dungeon. Now, like I also mentioned, not every dungeon has that same objective of get the 2 keys to open the door. There were definitely some other dungeons that have completely different objectives inside them, but I will agree that I think too many dungeons had that same type of objective. Maybe this one would have you go kill 2 mini bosses. Maybe this one would have you go kill 2 totems or something like that. And it all played out in a similar way for those dungeons that shared that objective. So I'm hoping that is more varied in the other regions of the game. And seeing some of the leaks of the endgame beta, there are definitely a lot more objectives in other dungeons throughout the game. And I do also hope that they keep adding on more ways for the dungeons to randomize their paths throughout. Because if you've run the same dungeon like a dozen times, you've probably seen a good chunk of the randomization that can happen in that dungeon. Now, this isn't necessarily the worst thing, because like I mentioned, there's going to be over 100 dungeons on launch. Having over 100, all with a few different ways to randomize their layout, is still going to add quite a lot of variation on the content you're doing. But I do hope they keep adding in new ways for the dungeons to be randomized. Now, just to give a slight teaser, I do know of some very different dungeons in other regions of the game that play quite a bit differently than the dungeons we've seen. So there is going to be some more variation that we haven't seen yet, but I'm right there with a lot of people that I hope they add more objectives and more ways for the dungeons to randomize their pathing and layouts. Now that brings us nicely into Fields of Hatred and the PvP for Diablo 4, because this is going to play a decent role in the endgame for any players that like PvP, because there's usually 2 sides of this discussion, either people wanting PvP to be balanced and wanting the developers to actually put time into balancing it so it's not just get one shot or be completely unkillable, but then there's PvE players that don't want anything in PvE being nerfed specifically because it's too strong in PvP. And I can see both sides of this argument, because Diablo-like games and ARPGs are much more PvE focused games. Most people aren't going to want to play these games for PvP, so the PvP community is always going to be more niche. But I do also think that PvP in Diablo 4 has some pretty big potential to actually make a game like this with a bigger focus on PvP. Because if you look at basically every other Diablo-like game or ARPG, they either don't have PvP or their PvP is super unbalanced and isn't used. Diablo 3's small amount of PvP was never balanced, basically never used. PoE has PvP that's basically never balanced because everybody just one-shots each other. And this is very similar across all the other games in this genre. So I do have a hope for Diablo 4 PvP that they at least somewhat balance PvP without affecting PvE, maybe have different modifiers or different statting for skills specifically in PvP. And then I also hope that they start adding in more pieces of PvP, because on launch, they're only going to have the open world Fields of Hatred. And it would be really cool down the road is if we got instance arenas that you could even have rankings for. You could have instance battlegrounds that have different cool objectives. You could just legitimately take all the objectives out of World of Warcraft, put them in Diablo, and they'd probably work pretty well. And that brings us to one of the biggest worries for a lot of people, which is itemization. Because if itemization is boring, that generally means a build creation is going to be more boring than normal. And I think build creation is one of the biggest parts of these type of games. Now, I will say that I think this is being over exaggerated a little bit just because so many people are directly comparing it to Path of Exile. And just to make it very clear, Diablo 4 and the Diablo franchise as a whole has never been as complex as Path of Exile is. Path of Exile is basically the most complex version of these type of games you're going to get. They have dozens of systems stacked on top of each other, massive skill trees, even their gemming in their just basic gear is your actual abilities, that link together in different ways. There is a massive amount of complexity, which is very good for players that like that very deep build creation complexity, but is also a pretty big turnoff to a lot of people that want a bit more of a simplified game, or that don't even get past seeing the skill tree for the first time. And with saying that, this doesn't mean I want Diablo to be super simplified, or even as simple as Diablo 4 is going to be on launch. I'm just being realistic that Diablo as a franchise has never been that complex. Now, a few years down the road, with this being the first live service Diablo game, we could definitely see them moving a bit more towards PoE, with having the systems have a bunch of different seasons stacked on top of each other, but in general, it's still going to be more simplified. But within itemization, one of the biggest worries is the kind of filler stats being more boring than they normally would be. So things like critical strike chance, critical strike damage, all of those affixes and filler stats, people are thinking are a bit more boring. And I would generally agree. I do think there are a few different stats that are going to be much more interesting into the end game, such as lucky hit chance that is tied into your skills, but you also need the different effects from different rolls to even proc that. And then you have things like your other on hit effects that can have synergies with different skills or effects from your class tree or paragon tree. So I do think once you get more into the end game, some of these filler stats are going to be much more interesting. But in general, I do agree that I think they need to keep adding more interesting stats into this section of the game. But then looking past those, you also have the legendary system, which if you don't know how this works, legendary effects can roll on a handful of different gear slots, and then you can take those legendary effects off that piece of gear and put it on another piece of gear if you want to. And there's some other systems to tie into this, but a lot of people also think that a good chunk of these legendary powers are pretty boring. And I would have to say that some of these legendary powers are definitely boring. They're kind of basic procs, basic damage increases or reductions, but you also have to keep in mind is that there are going to be, I think, around 300 legendary powers I've heard. We know for a fact that there's going to be over 100. So there is going to be a lot of options, and you can have one of these powers on every single piece of gear. So they can't be ultra complex, but I do have the same hope that we keep getting more legendary powers that kind of add in more complexity that ties more into your class's progression and skills and just gives you more interesting options. And we could talk all day about the itemization of Diablo 4, all the different systems that tie into it, if it's too boring, if it needs much more complexity, but on launch, it's going to be a much more simplified game than something like Path of Exile. So if you're somebody that is just super into the ultra complexity of something like Path of Exile, then maybe launch of Diablo 4 isn't going to be a game that's going to hold you long enough. Maybe you want to wait till a few seasons are out or an expansion is out to see if they've added more complexity on top of it. And that brings us to one of the biggest worries, especially from people within the Diablo community, specifically from Diablo 2, and that is trading. Because a lot of people want fully open trade. Now, how trading in Diablo 4 is going to work is kind of a mixture of open trading and no trading. So you're going to be able to trade up to rare gear pieces, but you're not going to be able to trade legendary or unique pieces. And it's seeming like you're also going to be able to trade some different currencies in the game. If I'm not mistaken, you're going to be able to trade gold, but I'm not sure how that's all going to pan out on release. And you're also able to trade gear with people in your party if you earned that gear when they're playing with you. So if you guys kill a boss together, you get a piece, you're still able to give that to them because they were with you when you killed it. But for trading with random people, it's only up to rare gear pieces. Now, if you're looking for a system that kind of appeases both sides, I think this is probably the best way to go about it, because even though you can't trade legendaries or uniques, rares are actually going to be the best in slot items in the game, because you're going to get the best rolls on a rare piece of gear. Then you're going to take a legendary roll of a legendary item and put that legendary power on that rare gear piece. So these base rare items are actually going to end up being most of your best in slot rolls, meaning you can trade the best in slot kind of base of items and then just put whatever legendary power you want on top of it. So there's still going to be a good chunk of trading, but I know a lot of people just want open trading. They want a good portion of their game to be about getting all these items, trading them, and playing that kind of player-driven market. And I will say there's something to be said about that player-driven market and making it feel much more like a community, even though those type of systems do bring in a good chunk of RMT. Now, I have done a video on a system that Diablo 4 could take from another game, just implement to their game, and it would probably be the best version of trading in any other game. And that's actually the system Last Epoch is developing. It essentially allows you to choose between one of two factions. One faction, you can trade anything you want. The other faction, you pretty much can't trade anything, but you get better drops and there's progression within those factions. But that's not what we're getting on Diablo 4's launch. So if you're somebody that a lot of your playtime is legitimately based around trading items to other players, Diablo 4's launch may not be the best for you. But the developers in their last live stream did specifically mention that if they get a lot of feedback saying people want trading to be changed, that they are completely willing to go back and change trading to what the player base wants. So if you're somebody that's going to be playing Diablo 4, give the feedback that you want trading to be more open, because it seems like they're pretty receptive into changing it if that's what the players want. So these are some of the biggest concerns I've seen around Diablo 4 from people in the community or people who are just interested in the game. And with me saying all this and giving all the information I could about these different systems, I would still say if there's something you don't like about the game or you think could be better, give that feedback in an actual respectable way. Remember, these developers are still people. If you're going to be a dick to them, they're probably not going to listen, but still give the feedback on these systems. But that's pretty much all I want to go over.